Which mode on your camera is most effective to shoot super awesome photos of wildlife? In this video, let's explore the various camera modes and figure out which one is most effective for wildlife photography. I'm Girish Menon and I just show up on your screen and start talking about photography. I post new videos all the time, so please subscribe to my channel so that you don't miss out. In order to understand which mode is most effective for wildlife photography, let's reverse engineer the process. So let's look at the desired result. What is it about the picture that you yearn the most? Obviously, sharpness. So when photographing any living creature, if the eye or the eyes are even a little out of focus, that image appears completely out of focus. So even if the focus is on the nose of the subject or somewhere on the body but not on the eye, when you look at the picture, for some reason it just does not appear to be super sharp. So we need the sharpness at the place where it's most effective, which is the eye, and at the same time we want the exposure to be perfect. Present day image editing software make it very easy to make a picture brighter or darker. However, as far as I'm concerned, it's important to get the exposure absolutely perfect in the camera itself at the time of clicking pictures. So let's understand the three aspects of exposure: aperture, ISO and shutter speed. When clicking pictures of wildlife, we invariably set our aperture to the widest possible value available on our lens, which could be 5.6, it could be 4, it could be 2.8, depending on which lens we are using. With the aperture set at its widest, the lens is going to bring in as much light as it can, which means that we are going to invariably get a faster shutter speed. But before we talk about shutter speed, let's understand ISO sensitivity. So the ISO sensitivity is the sensitivity of your sensor to light. At smaller values such as 100, 200, 400, the sensor is less sensitive to light. But when we are clicking pictures out in bright light, we can use smaller ISO values. Smaller ISO values produce better image quality and better color reproduction. When we are clicking in low light, we have no option but to increase the ISO further. Present day cameras give us excellent image quality even at 1600 ISO. So don't shy away from using higher ISO values when necessary. Now let's talk about shutter speed. When we are clicking a subject, a bird or an animal that's just sitting over there, we can get by with slower shutter speeds such as 1/60th of a second or 1/100th of a second, even with the lens extended all the way out to 500 millimeters. But if the bird or the animal is moving around, slow shutter speeds are going to give us that motion blur. Especially when clicking birds in flight, we often require very fast shutter speeds such as 1/2000th of a second or 1/4000th of a second. Since we usually always set the aperture to the widest possible aperture on the lens, you might think that the aperture priority mode is an effective mode for wildlife photography. In the aperture priority mode, we set the aperture value and the camera automatically computes the shutter speed based on the ISO. So let's consider this first case where we set the camera to aperture priority, keep the ISO on auto and let the camera figure out the shutter speed on its own. Now, when we are clicking birds in action, remember the camera does not know what we are clicking and what the speed of action is and what is the minimum shutter speed requirement to get super sharp images of that action. Very often you will find your images are not going to be super sharp because the resulting shutter speed is not fast enough to freeze that action. So it's very important for us to know what our shutter speed needs to be, the minimum shutter speed requirement to get sharp pictures of that action. That's why the aperture priority mode is not as effective in most situations, except when the subject is not moving very rapidly. So that brings us to the next mode, shutter priority. In the shutter priority mode, we set the shutter speed and let the camera figure out the aperture. We can look at our subject and the pace of its movement and figure out what the shutter speed needs to be, and let the camera figure out the aperture value. So let's take this second case scenario where we set the camera on shutter priority, set the aperture to auto, and let the camera figure out the aperture value. Very often, especially in low light, if we set a fast shutter speed and the camera requires a wider aperture which is just not available on the lens, then the pictures will turn out underexposed. So it's very important for us to have total control over the aperture and the shutter speed. So that brings us to case number 3. Setting the camera in the manual mode, setting the aperture value to the widest and the shutter speed to what we think is needed for that scenario, and set the ISO to auto. This is a very effective way of doing things, more effective than aperture priority and shutter priority, because here we have set both the aperture and shutter speed according to the action that we are clicking, and have the ISO on auto. However, very often the exposure isn't super awesome. It's either too bright or too dark. To ensure that we click a perfect exposure in camera, get super sharpness, it is imperative to learn how to use the camera in the manual mode. Once you learn how to click pictures in the manual mode, you will be able to nail a super fine exposure every single time and nail focus exactly where you want it. To ensure that my focus is nailed exactly where I want it, I set my autofocus area to single point and move that point around in my viewfinder and align that with the eye of the bird. If we let the camera decide where the focus should be, very often the camera will set the focus on the body of the bird, or maybe on the beak, or maybe even on the background, and consequently the creature will be completely out of focus. One of the biggest apprehensions about using the camera in the manual mode is whether there will be sufficient time to set all these parameters when clicking action. I find that there's always plenty of time, because if you are banking on just spraying the camera around and getting whatever you can, well, that's not going to be a very effective long-term solution. The best pictures are those which you compose in your mind's eye, set the exposure right, and then go about clicking pictures. And I find that most often I do have sufficient time to do this. And remember, once we set the exposure, even if the bird or the animal moves around slightly, that exposure value is not going to change. Here's my biggest secret in wildlife photography. Are you ready? I set my metering mode to spot metering, and I align my focus point on green foliage and set the exposure for that green foliage, and anything in that frame is going to be perfectly exposed once I set my exposure on that green foliage. That's the beauty about spot metering. I'd like to encourage you to read more about spot metering, and especially about Ansel Adams' zone system for black and white photography, because that applies to color photography, digital photography, even today. Understanding Ansel Adams' zone system will give you a better understanding of exposure and how to go about setting the exposure manually. If you'd like to master wildlife photography, I can teach you everything that you need to know over live one-on-one video calls. During these sessions, I'll show you how to use your camera in the manual mode, and we'll unpack all the crucial settings available on your camera so that you can actually start clicking the pictures that you envision, the pictures that you yearn for. Wildlife photography is a big effort, but more importantly, it's the time that you invest to go out on these safaris and click these pictures. And if you end up with shaky, out of focus, underexposed or overexposed pictures, that can be pretty disappointing, can't it? I'll show you all the tips and tricks that you need to know in order to ensure that you end up clicking remarkable pictures in any situation every single time. At this point in time, I've taught photography to over 10,000 photography buffs. In addition to these 10,000 awesome individuals, I've also facilitated workshops at schools, colleges, and corporate establishments. I was also a visiting faculty at the University of Mumbai for photography. Now you know more about the modes on your camera, which will help you to click better pictures. I'm Girish Menon. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and have a look at the other videos on wildlife photography that I have for you on my channel.